Welcome to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. My guest today is Dr. Ellen Winter, one of the leading researchers in the psychology of the arts. She's done foundational research on visual arts, writing, and music. Her work helps us understand teaching and learning, and most of all, her studies help us understand how people think and how our minds work. I'm delighted to have Dr. Ellen Winter today on The Science of Creativity. I'm here with Dr. Ellen Winter, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Ellen, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
To get ready for our interview, I looked at everything I could find about you, your 5 books that you've authored. You have a 51-page CV with scientific articles, invited keynote lectures, all sorts of honors and awards. You're one of the most influential researchers in psychology and the arts. So I'm just curious, of all that research, when you first meet someone at a party, what's the first thing you would say about yourself?
Well, I would say I'm a psychologist, but not a clinician. I'm a research psychologist, and I've always been passionate about the arts, and my research is on the psychology of the arts, which you probably don't know much about. You might not even know what it is, but I'm happy to tell you if you want me to.
Right, the psychology of the arts, exactly. And that's the subtitle. The first book I became familiar with of yours was something you wrote in 1982 called Invented Worlds, where the subtitle actually is The Psychology of the Arts. And my own copy, I've got highlights all over it and notes in the margin, and the binder is falling apart.
I know you sent me a picture. I'm so flattered.
Right. So what is the psychology of the arts? What can psychology tell us about art?
Well, the psychology of the arts is many, many things. And of course, I don't do all of those things, but it encompasses the psychology of the maker, the artist, what makes artists tick, how do they develop, are artists born or are they made? It also encompasses the psychology of the audience member, the viewer, the reader, what makes us gravitate to the arts, how do we respond to the arts, why do we get pleasure out of the arts, why do we seek out art forms that sometimes may upset us or make us sad when we would certainly avoid such situations in our personal life, how are the arts represented in our brains, what happens when brains break down after strokes or Alzheimer's, are the arts ever preserved, how do children develop in the arts, what about art prodigies, how do they develop? Those are just a few of the questions that I'm interested in.
I think a lot of people, when they think about psychology and creativity, they think about the psychology of the creator. And that's interesting that you also talked about what goes on in the mind when people are, I guess, perceiving art or, let's say, listening to music. So what's that like? Is it different from the creator?
Well, I think it's very different because what goes on in the creator's mind is very hard to pin down, but there have been a number of studies that have tried to do that. It's maybe easier to pin down a bit about what goes on in the audience members, the viewers, the perceiver's mind, because we can ask people what they feel and what they think. And one of the things we know is that the arts give us pleasure. And another thing we know is that we even get pleasure out of sadness from art. And that's a kind of a mysterious paradox, but there's been some really interesting research about why that might be.
Oh, could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think the most interesting research that's been done on this has been by Winfried Menninghaus, who was until recently the director of the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, Germany. And he developed a model called the distancing embracing model to account for why we seek out art that upsets us. And the argument is that when we look at, say, a painting of a tragic subject, or when we listen to very, very sad music, but let's stick with the visual arts. When we look at a painting of a tragic subject, we might feel horror, we might feel sadness or grief, but there's a kind of aesthetic distance also because we know that we're looking at a work of art and we know this is not happening directly to us. So we can experience the negative emotions, but from a distance. And we can also make meaning out of it. And when we make meaning out of it, we get pleasure. Making meaning is pleasurable. So we can feel both pleasure and negative emotions. And this is kind of at the heart of what it means to be moved by art. When we're very moved, we feel a mixture of positive and negative emotions.
It's funny because I always say that I'm a very optimistic and happy person. So I tend to seek out happy art or art that would show, I don't know, fun or nice things. So I guess I'm missing out on, what would you say?
Give me an example of happy art that you think is great.
Oh, I'd say, like abstract expressionism, like Stuart Davis, whose paintings are inspired by jazz improvisation, happy, bright colors dancing around on the canvas.
How about in literature? Have you ever read a novel that you thought was great that was all happy?
Yeah, actually, I tend to enjoy comic novels.
Ah, okay. So you wouldn't, for instance, like to read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment or Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which are pretty tragic.
I haven't sought them out, no.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Okay,
might.
well,
So yeah, tell me why. How would you sell me on reading something like that?
I am drawn to very difficult subjects in art and literature. For instance, I often watch films that are connected to the Holocaust. My family was involved in the Holocaust. I'm a second generation survivor, and I am completely fascinated by it. And I feel horror when I read or watch these things, but I also find it's very important to me to bear witness. And one of the arguments that Menninghaus makes is that by having these negative emotions from art, because they're from art and we have a certain distance from them because we know it's not happening to us, we can actually explore those emotions and maybe even learn to cope with them when they affect us in real life. So I'm drawn to tragic art. I don't mind. I love Stuart Davis too, but I think it's interesting though, if you look at ads for movies or books, and you look at the ones that say this is a really great, powerful story, they might often say a great, powerful, tragic novel. I don't think you often see a great, powerful, happy novel. Those terms don't tend to go together.
At the beginning of our interview, you said when you're introducing yourself at a party, you'd say you're not the kind of psychologist that is a therapist. You don't help people. But it sounds like with this type of art, you're describing a therapeutic experience. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. It is therapeutic for me to read tragic novels or to watch tragic films. It's a kind of what Aristotle said, it's a kind of catharsis. And a lot of artists have said, if I couldn't paint, I would go crazy. It's my therapy. So I think artists view making art as a form of keeping themselves sane. It's what they have to do.
Right. And perceiving the art is a form of therapy too. Do you think the psychological processes are similar in some way between the maker and the perceiver?
That's a tough question. I mean, the perceiver has to get inside the work and also make all kinds of attributions about the thinking of the creator. What was he thinking here? What was she thinking there? Why did she make that decision?
That's interesting that the artist sometimes has a therapeutic experience when they're creating. And you've also said that when you're perceiving art, the perceiver can have that therapeutic experience. So is it similar? Is there something similar about what goes on in the mind?
I think that's a tricky question, and it's a fascinating question. I don't think that the perceiver is creating. I think they are entering into a creator's mind. So in that sense, I think it's different. But of course, the perceiver also has to construct meaning about the work of art, and that is a creative act. So there is creativity involved in both the making and the perceiving. But the mind of the artist is very unusual. Most people are not artists, but most people enjoy the arts. So I think there's something atypical about the mind of a very creative artist, but all of us flock to the arts. So it's not identical.
That's one thing that interested me that you said at the beginning and that you said in your book. You said, here's a quotation, that artistic activity is not simply a luxury available to the leisure classes. So the artist, maybe not everybody might be a top artist, but everyone has this ability to enjoy art, to perceive art. So now your psychological research becomes a psychology of everybody, right? Not just the creators.
Exactly. And I always wonder why psychology textbooks don't have a chapter on the arts. They have a chapter on memory and attention and language. Those are all very important human universals, but so are the arts. And we all know they've been around since the earliest humans. And there's no culture that hasn't had the arts. And everybody is involved in the arts in some way, not necessarily high arts, but in watching television dramas, listening to music on their iPods. It's all over the place. You can't escape it. Everybody's involved in the arts in some way.
Have you done research on what happens in people's minds when they're perceiving art or when they're enjoying or experiencing therapeutic experience in art? What sort of research have you done like that?
Well, I haven't done much research in that area, but I have researched what happens when people look at a forgery and how that knowing that something is a forgery changes their appreciation of it.
That's fascinating. So they don't know it's a forgery until you tell them? Is that it?
Well, yes. Well, this is actually the phenomenon is not my research. The phenomenon is that if you're looking at a work of art and you find it powerful and enjoyable and you're told and great and you're told it's a forgery, your whole reaction to it changes and you start to find flaws in it and you don't like it as much. And there have been a number of studies by other people who've shown that the same work said to be an original by one group of people, said to be a forgery by another group of people, is disliked more in the forgery group. It's perceived as less good, less beautiful. It's even perceived as smaller in size. So we don't like forgeries. But of course, there's all kinds of reasons why we might not like forgeries. First of all, we think they're immoral, and that could bleed over into our aesthetic appreciation of the work. Or we think they're not worth as much money, and that could bleed over. Oh, and we might just think that it's not, that there's something very special about the original. We did do some research looking at what happens if you rule out immorality and you rule out lesser monetary value. So we asked people to compare two copies, a copy that was made by the artist of the artist's original and a copy that was made by the artist's assistant of the artist's original. And we made sure these two copies were absolutely identical because they were just cut and paste. We used a real work of art and we simply duplicated it. So we asked people to rate them on a variety of dimensions. And what we found is the copy by the assistant is rated less good than the copy by the artist in terms of how creative it is and how likely it is to be influential. And there was one other criterion, but I can't remember what it was. But mostly it was perceived as less creative and less likely to be influential. Note that the two images were identical and they were both signed by the artist. And we had people rate whether it was immoral for an artist's assistant to make a copy and then have the artist sign his or her name. And we found that the immorality ratings did not predict the answer. So we can rule out, and they were both said to be exactly the same value on the art market. So we can rule out moral misattribution, monetary misattribution. It appears to be that we just think there's something very special about something the artist makes, even if it's a copy of the artist's original. And I think this comes down to is a kind of magical belief or essentialism, that we think that artists imbue their works with some kind of essence of themselves. So that when you look at an original Picasso, you are looking at something that Picasso actually worked on, and you're feeling like you're communing with Picasso. And if you know you're looking at a copy of Picasso by an assistant, you're not really interested in communing with the assistant's mind. You want to communicate with the great genius's mind. And so I think that this view that the original is special and we dislike forgery because it's not by the artist has something to do with kind of irrational belief that the artist has imbued their essence into the work. And we don't want the essence of the forger. We want the essence of the artist. It's like if you lost your wedding ring and you replaced it with a perfectly good duplicate, identical. It's not the same thing. It doesn't have the essence of the original.
Yeah, that seems right to me, that when I am in a museum and I'm standing in front of a painting by Picasso, for example, yeah, I do feel like I'm seeing the genius or the mind or the process of Picasso in what I'm looking at. Like it's a form of, yeah, it's a form of a communication, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And I think that when we're looking at works of art, we're thinking of the work of art as a form of communication. And so we're thinking about the mind that made it and why the mind made it and what the process was. So we spend a lot of time ferreting out the artist's intention. Oh, I was just going to say, and so we don't judge a work of art just by the final product. We can't help but take the inferred process into account.
Right, that our perception of the artwork, I've heard some people use this term mediated. So the perception of the work is mediated by what we know already about the work. It's not an unmediated encounter with the work.
Right. So, for example, take an image of a cave painting, and you can find maybe a similar painting of say a bison. You might find a similar painting by Picasso that has a similar form of animal. But when we know it was made so many years ago by the earliest humans in dark caves, it means something different to us. It was like the first image. Or similarly, if you look at the first paintings in the Renaissance that use linear perspective, that is a greater achievement than linear perspective used today. And that affects how we respond to the work.
You said that art is an everyday activity and it's just part of how our minds work, that the arts are fundamental ways of knowing the world. So, yeah, it seems like we're kind of getting there. What does it mean when you say knowing the world?
Well, some people think of the arts as purely emotional activities, emotional arenas. I have been influenced by the philosopher Nelson Goodman, who founded our research group, Project Zero, and he argued very strongly and somewhat controversially that the arts are cognitive activities. They are ways of making sense of the world. They're different from scientific investigations. Those are also ways of making sense of the world, but using very different methods. The arts help us understand our world, meaning let's just say if you read a work of literature where there are really complex characters, that it helps you to understand what people are like. And you will meet people in literature that you would never meet in real life, because where are you going to meet Ahab after the white whale in Moby Dick? Or where are you going to meet Richard II in Shakespeare's play? You're going to be introduced to a huge variety of humans that you wouldn't meet in your real life, and you learn a lot about human nature that way, and probably about yourself.
Right, ways of coming to know people, know the world. And you said it was different from scientific understanding. Could you say more about that?
Well, a scientist will investigate what people are like by observing and experimenting and giving them tests. And this is more what you understand from literature is more based on your own intuitions.
Right. It's a kind of, intuition, experiential. You mentioned Project Zero, and that's
Yes.
fascinating to me. I wanted to hear more about that. I know you've been affiliated with this research group called Project Zero at Harvard. So, yeah, tell us about Project Zero, and I guess start with what does the name mean? It sounds like it might, I don't know, be a science fiction movie, but I know it's not.
Well, Project Zero was founded in 1967 by the philosopher Nelson Goodman, and he was a lover of the arts. And he wrote a book called Languages of Art. And he argued that the reason it was called Project Zero is because he said, we're going to start from ground zero. There's very little systematic knowledge about cognition and learning in the arts. So we're going to start from ground zero and build up a body of knowledge. So that's why it's called Project Zero. And we've never changed the name, although we do think we've moved from 0 to 1. I'll tell you how I found out how I got introduced to Project Zero, if you'd like to hear the story.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When
Okay.
was that?
Well, I was an English major in college. I was always very interested in art and visual art. And I told my parents that I wanted to go to art school, not college. My parents said, first you get a BA and then you can go to art school. So I went to college. I majored in English literature, and I didn't take much art because I went to Radcliffe, which is now Harvard. And in my interview, the dean said to me, what are you interested in? And I said, I'm interested in art. And she said, quote unquote, Radcliffe girls don't have time for art. So there wasn't any art making. I took art classes Saturday in the evening sometimes, but no real art classes. And when I graduated, I decided to go to art school, and I went to the Museum of Fine Arts School in Boston, and I studied painting, and I really loved it. But after 1 year, I quit. I quit because I thought, I don't think I'm cut out for this. This is really difficult. And of course, I read your forthcoming book, and you talk about how majoring in art is more difficult than any other major if you're really working at it hard. And I would agree with that. It is really hard. But I just didn't think I was going to make it as an artist. So I thought, what am I going to do? I think I don't want to go on in English literature. I think I'll be a clinical psychologist. I'd always vowed I would never be an academic because both my parents were academics, and I heard them all my life saying, "Oh, I have so much work. I can't catch up. Oh, I have missed this deadline. Oh." And I thought academics work too hard. I don't want that life. So I was going to be a clinical psychologist, and I was thinking about applying to graduate school when I found a notice of a job opening at this place called Project Zero. And it said, a researcher wanted in psychology of art. And I thought, I have no idea what psychology of art is, but those are my two interests, so I'll apply. And so I ended up doing research at Project Zero in developmental psychology of the arts for 2 years. And during that time, I thought, I'm not going to be a clinical psychologist at all. I want to be a developmental psychologist and do research on the development of the arts. And so then I applied to developmental psychology graduate school and got a degree in developmental psychology. And then I got a job, my first and only job as an academic. And yes, I did become an academic, despite the fact that I said I never would, at Boston College in the psychology department. And the good thing about that was I could keep one foot at Project Zero. And so I've always been partly at Project Zero doing research on the arts and on art education. And now I have retired from teaching a few years ago, and I've made Project Zero my full-time home. And what I'm doing now is tracking the impact and spread of Project Zero's educational ideas all over the world via qualitative, in-depth interviews. Because Project Zero has existed since 1967 only on grants and gifts. We have no endowment. So we've gotten tons and tons of grants and gifts over the years. We've been very successful, but those were to develop research. They were never to track the impact of our research. And I think that's very true of educational research in general. People do all this research and then they don't track what's happened to it. They just let it out in the world. So now I'm busy tracking the impact, and I'm finding some amazing things.
You mentioned developmental psychology, and for listeners who don't know, that's studying very young children and how their minds or how their understanding develops. So, yeah, what does developmental psychology have to tell us about the arts?
Well, one thing it tells us, very interesting thing that I got involved in was a study of what we called the U-shaped curve, and I'll spell that out. Young children are very playful and imaginative, and they gravitate to the arts, and they make art, they paint, they make metaphors, they dance, they sing. They're little artists, and their works are very charming. My house is filled with artworks by very young children, but not by kids 9 or 10 or 11, because as kids get older, their artworks get much less interesting to me. They get very conventional, and children are striving towards realism at these ages. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that I love the playful work of young children, and you see a real decline in playfulness over the years. And we call it a U-shaped curve because the curve only goes up again for those who go on to become artists. And if you look at modern artists, such as 20th century modernists like Paul Klee, and you look at their work as children and their work as adults, and there's a lot of similarity. But if you look at Paul Klee's work at age 12, it's highly realistic and technical, much less interesting, but probably something very necessary that Klee had to go through before he could break away from realism again. So I think there's something very special about young children's artistry that is regained by artists. And this is true really only of the 20th century in the West. You certainly didn't see that in the Renaissance because art strove to be realistic. And the development of representation is one of the amazing stories of art history, and how representation got increasingly realistic until the 19th century, when Impressionism broke away from that. And in the 20th century, you have artists who are influenced by the work of young children, like Picasso, who famously said, "I used to draw like Raphael, but it's taken me my whole life to learn to draw like a child."
Right. And like a child, I think you mean preschool, maybe up to age 6. So none of these children
Yes.
have had any education in art. And when you say art, it's sketching, I guess, or just with a crayon on paper. So they haven't had any training. So it means that what they're generating is, I don't know, would you say it's more pure, coming straight out of their minds? But that word mediated again, it's not mediated.
It's unadulterated by adult influence. And of course, the progressive art movement, which started in the 20th century, influenced by the writings of John Dewey, of course, argued that children should not be copying. In 19th century art education, kids were given geometric forms to copy, and then more complicated forms to copy. And what was important was realism and neatness. But progressive art educators said, no, do not ask kids to copy what adults have done. That contaminates the purity of young children's art. Let them make art on their own and make discoveries on their own, which is a very Western thing. I was doing research in art education in China in 1987, and what we saw there was copying. Children would make 6-year-old children, very complicated, traditional-looking ink and brush paintings in the Chinese style of things like shrimp. And I saw a whole classroom of 6-year-olds who produced, by the end of the class, things that looked like prodigy art, very complicated paintings. But how was it done? It was done step by step, copying the lines of the teacher and the lines in the textbook that each child had on their desk. And so you build up from very simple forms to a very complex form. That is, of course, completely against the progressive view of how young children should be allowed to make art. But I'm not sure it makes sense to say one is good and one is bad, because if you look at Chinese art, it's just as great as Western art, but Chinese art education has always been based on this kind of painstaking copying, whereas 20th century Western art education is much more of a free-for-all. But I would like to say that good progressive art education is not really a free-for-all. The art educator is supposed to set up challenging visual things for kids to do, and there has to be standards. So it's not just mess around, do whatever you want, but it's not copying. For instance, you might say to a child, paint something that you saw on your way to school today, relying on the child's memory. Or you might even have them go outside and say, paint what you see. But that's not copying from a picture. It's recording their own sense impressions and never pushing the child to be realistic.
Well, that leads me to something I really wanted to talk about, which is your 2007 book. It's called Studio Thinking, and it is exactly about this, right? Where you and some colleagues went into schools to see how art teachers were creating these kinds of environments. And you did find that, right? That you didn't let the children do whatever they wanted, but that there was some sort of guidance going on.
Yes. So the work that we did on studio thinking was actually in high schools, although I did apply some of that work to a kindergarten class of 5-year-olds. And I'll say what I did with the 5-year-olds, and then I'll back up and say what studio thinking was all about. I set up still lifes for these young children, and people said, 5-year-olds can't draw from observation. But I showed them images. For example, I showed them many different images of skies by different painters. And I said, look, there's all kinds of ways to do skies. Or showed them many different still lifes and showed them there's all kinds of ways to do this. And then I would set up a still life and let them go. And they would be looking, but they weren't copying a picture. And it was just amazing what kids could do. They were really observing. Studio thinking, that came out of a project that we called REAP, Reviewing Education in the Arts Project. And that was a project that I carried out at Project Zero with Lois Hetland, my colleague. And we decided to take a really careful look at studies purporting to show that arts education improves academic performance in children. And we've all heard the claim that arts make you smarter, music makes you smarter, kids who study music do better on SAT scores, et cetera, et cetera. And we were somewhat skeptical because we couldn't figure out what the mechanism would be for why learning to draw would make you better at math or reading, for example. So we did what's called a meta-analysis of all the studies we could get our hands on, published and unpublished, looking at this question. And what we found is there is a very strong correlation between taking a lot of arts classes and doing well on academic tests. But if you look at the experimental studies, you find absolutely no effect. So what this says to us is kids who do well in academics may go to schools that are strong in the arts, or they may come from families that value both. But if you just take a bunch of kids and divide them in half randomly and give one kid a lot of arts and one group not art or less art, you do not find improvement in their test scores or in their grades. And we published this, and we got a lot of pushback. We were told we should not have published this. This is going to be really bad for art education because art educators need to be able to say that what they're doing will help test scores because that's what is important. And we said, no, we're trying to change the conversation. Art teachers should not have to try to justify what they're doing by raising test scores. And as soon as a smart principal finds out that it's not true, if that's the only reason the arts are in schools, then there's no more reason for them to be in schools. So the arts need to be there for their own sake. And so we decided to study what students in high-quality visual arts classes are actually being taught. And that's what led to our studio thinking work, which is so connected to what you've done in your wonderful new book at looking at the college level of art study. We observed classes in painting and ceramics and drawing in 2 different schools, and we videotaped everything that was going on, and we interviewed the students. Mostly we interviewed the professors. And then we spent another year figuring out what the videotapes showed. And we ended up making the claim, based really carefully on our videotape data, that what the teachers were teaching were very big, broad habits of mind or dispositions that are important in the arts. They're important in life in general. These are thinking dispositions that are important in the visual arts. And they're important in life. Let me just give you a few of them. Learning to see. You wrote in your book that learning to see is extremely hard and maybe the most important thing that visual arts teachers are teaching. And I think learning to see, learning to observe carefully is what we saw going on all the time. Look really closely at the world, look really closely at your work, look really closely at others' work. Learning to observe. That was one of them. Another one was learning to envision, to generate mental images of what you're planning to do, even if you don't necessarily follow that. The envision possibilities in your work. Because teachers would often say, well, what would happen if you pushed this form over here, or if you darkened that color? And that would require students to generate a mental image, something that was not seen, that they had to imagine. Another really important habit of mind is reflection. The ability to think about your process, to become metacognitive, and also to be able to critique your process, and most importantly, to be able to take the critique of a teacher and use that to inform your work. I think that's something that in all walks of life is a very important skill, and it may be taught best in the art studio. So that's a little background on our studio thinking work, which I'm gratified to see has actually been adopted as a framework. It's not a curriculum, it's a lens or a framework. And it's been adopted by many educators in the United States and in other places of the world as well, as I found out in the impact study that I'm doing.
The framework you're talking about, the sort of habits of mind that are developed in these high school classes that you observed, where the students are working under the teacher's guidance. And then that framework is in, of course, your 2007 book, Studio Thinking. And now tell me more about that. It sounds like you're saying this has blossomed and it's grown around the world and it's starting to influence education. So is that right?
Yes, it is. Amazingly, that's what happened. And so teachers are basically talking to kids about the importance of looking really closely or the importance of reflection on their process. These get named. So teachers will say, well, I was kind of doing that. Good teachers will say, I was kind of doing this already, but you've given me names for what I'm doing. You've given me a structure to think about. So, instead of saying we're teaching skills in art class, teachers can say we're teaching thinking habits, we're teaching dispositions, habits of mind that your child will find useful in the visual arts, and it may generalize outside of the visual arts. Now, I have students that have taken this approach and have tried to apply it to other art forms. So Jill Hogan, a former doctoral student of mine, applied this to high school orchestra and band classes. And she didn't find the same habits of mind being taught. Some of them were parallel, but they were there. Some of them were unique to the art form. And then another former student of mine, Talia Goldstein, has applied this to theater and has just published a book on theater habits of mind. Again, they're not the same as visual arts habit of mind. You wouldn't expect them to be the same, but it's the approach that is the same.
And your writing has ranged pretty broadly. We've been talking a lot about the visual arts, but in your books, you also talk about writing and music. And now you've had these students who've taken your studio model and are applying it to these other art forms.
Yes, though I've focused most on the visual arts because that's my area. That's what I grew up wanting to be an artist, a visual artist, and I'm passionate about the visual arts.
Oh, I didn't know about your 1 year in an MFA program. That's
Yeah.
fascinating, and it helps me understand how you got interested later in this studio model.
I have to say, though, I don't think I got the kind of quality education at the museum school that you describe. It was not that rigorous. So maybe things have changed, but this was a long time ago. This was in 1969, 70.
So what has the impact been of the studio model? Have you been traveling, let's say, to other countries? Has the book been translated into other languages?
I've found evidence of it being used in Singapore, for example. And that's pretty amazing that a lot of teachers in Singapore are using it, art educators. And we've also won Studio Thinking 2, and Studio Thinking 3. And we've also published a book called Studio Thinking from the Start, which was about, we went around all over the country to kindergarten and elementary school art classes, and saw how teachers had taken our approach, which was found with high school students, and adapted it for younger students. So it's been pretty widely used. And there's also a movement called Teaching for Artistic Behavior. I don't know if you've heard of this, TAB. It's a movement that's growing in elementary schools in the United States. And the argument is that when kids come to art class, they should be treated like artists. Don't give them projects to do. Let them come up with their own projects. Provide lots of rich materials, give them instruction on various kinds of techniques, and then just let them come up with their own assignments. Don't give them an assignment. And some people think this is too free. Other people say if it's done well, it really works. But one thing we've found out is that TAB teachers are using studio thinking, the studio thinking model, as a way of kind of structuring what they're doing. And that's a growing movement all over the United States.
Well, you're right that arts educators are always having to defend what they do when budgets get cut or when seems like there's such an emphasis on science and technology and math. And then one of the defenses of arts education was that if you engage in arts, it'll make you better at math or better at science. And that was your meta-analysis that you referred to, saying, well, we don't really know, the evidence isn't that strong. And honestly, when I read that, I also think, well, if you really wanted someone to be better at math, you should probably teach them more math instead of teaching them painting and hoping that it might, feed over. But it also seems to demean the arts to say we're only teaching it so you can do better at math. So I remember that article of yours was pretty controversial at the time because arts educators were, hey, this is one of our defenses for keeping arts in the curriculum and you're taking it away from us. Right, right. But then you came back with the studio thinking, and now you're teaching some pretty powerful stuff in arts classes. You're teaching habits of mind. And it seems to me like those habits of mind, like you said, they could generalize outside of the arts, right?
Absolutely. Learning to look in science class, learning to take criticism and improve your work in any area, whether it's on the job or in school. But it's very hard to show that kind of transfer. Very hard, because you have to come up with tests of observation, tests of envisioning. And so maybe somebody will do that, but I'm not in the test making profession.
Oh, I was thinking that too when you talked about these habits of mind that, someone's going to try to have those on a test or an assessment to see if you really have developed an ability to reflect on your process, right?
Absolutely. I think that would be important to do. It's just that I'm not going to be the one doing it. It's got to be done well with a qualitative test, not any kind of standardized multiple choice test. Because all we did is show what was taught. We did not measure what was learned. We can infer what was learned, but we didn't measure it. And I think in your new book, you're really talking about what the teachers say they're teaching, not you're not actually assessing whether the students have learned those things, right? Am I correct?
Right, right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's really hard to do. But the first step is what's being taught.
Right, or what the teachers tell you. And you did the same thing, right? You interviewed high school teachers where I had interviewed, college teachers,
Yes,
right?
yes. And you interviewed many, many more than we did. Your work is very wide ranging. I'm just so amazed by how many interviews you analyzed.
Well, your books have been so influential. If my book reaches 1/10 of all the people of your work, I'll be very pleased. I wanted to talk a little bit about your 2019 book, which is called How Art Works,
Mhm.
Psychological Exploration. And when I first saw this book, I thought that's a very ambitious title, How Art Works.
Yeah.
And then I thought further and I said, well, what does it mean for art to work? That seems like an odd verb to put there with
Mm.
art. So what does that mean that art works?
I think I really meant, how does it function? How does it function for the maker? How does it function for the perceiver? Let's unpack it. Does that make sense to you?
How does it function for the perceiver? Is that right?
How it functions for the perceiver, how it functions for the maker. It really is a way of saying art unpacked. Let's unpack what the arts are and what they do for us and why we have them.
Yeah, it's a psychological question, right? How it's functioning in the
Yes,
mind.
exactly. It was entirely a psychological approach. And I think the subtitle was a psychological exploration.
Right. So that's interesting that you would say art is something that has a function or a psychological impact, a function on the mind. After all, you are a psychologist studying the arts, right?
Absolutely. I wanted to make the case that the most interesting psychology of the arts work grows out of philosophy, the philosophy of aesthetics, which asks big questions like, what is the nature of beauty? How do we evaluate works of art? What's the relationship between responding to art and feeling pleasure? Those are questions that were first asked by philosophers. And I think that when psychologists try to turn those questions around so that they can be tested empirically, you get some very interesting research. For instance, a philosopher would ask, what is art? What should count as art? Whereas a psychologist would say, what do ordinary people think is art? Those are very different questions, but the question the psychologist asked was first formulated by the philosopher. And of course, psychology and philosophy have always been, psychology really grew out of philosophy. And it's the same for psychology of the arts, growing out of the philosophy of aesthetics.
Earlier in the interview, you mentioned the philosopher Nelson Goodman, who was the person who founded Project Zero in 1967. So he's a philosopher. And then I associate Project Zero with psychology, right? Or developmental psychology. So it, as you say, grew out of that philosophical perspective, right?
Right. And Nelson Goodman was only the director of Project Zero for a few years, and then he turned it over to Dave Perkins and Howard Gardner, his first two research assistant hires, and said, you guys take it from here. And David Perkins was a computer scientist, and Howard, of course, was a psychologist at the time and still is. But David became really psychological. And so they really made it into a psychological rather than a philosophical organization. And the first decade of Project Zero was related to straight cognitive and developmental psychology research on the arts. David Perkins did research on artists making art, and he did process tracing studies where artists had to stop every 5 seconds and say what they were thinking as they were creating to try to get at the decisions they were making. And Howard ran a developmental group at Project Zero where he studied the development of children in the arts. And these were not education research. This was straight psychology research. And it was only after the first decade that Project Zero took a turn towards education. And now everything Project Zero does has something to do with education.
It's an impressive record for a research lab like this to start in 1967 and to still be. And I know you're retired. I think Howard Gardner is retired, and you're passing it on to the next generation of researchers.
That's true, although we're still very involved. But I want to just stress that Project Zero has no endowment. It has survived all these years by grants and gifts. And I think that's very unusual for an organization. Another thing that's unusual about Project Zero is many people have spent their whole lives there. I'm a case in point, but other people as well, who come on maybe as a research assistant, and then they grow up through the ranks, and they have spent their whole lives in doing research projects there. There have been about a handful of directors, and they're all still at Project Zero. They're all still part of it. So Project Zero survives the individual director and keeps going. And now we're getting a brand new website. So I think we're going to be spiffing up a bit.
That's great. I'll put that in the episode notes so that our listeners can go learn more about Project Zero. It's been a great interview. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I always like to end by asking, do you have any advice for our listeners, something they could do in the next week that might enhance their creativity or some activity they could participate in the next week?
You warned me you were going to ask this question, and so I did think about it a bit, and I remembered something that Nelson Goodman once said. There was a discussion about how to enhance creativity, and he said, don't try to enhance it, put up obstacles. And I think what he meant by this is put up obstacles that challenge you. And I think I'd like to end by saying I think that to enhance creativity, give yourself obstacles that are challenging, but just challenging enough, not so challenging that you're completely defeated by it, but challenges that allow you to maybe even get into flow. So, for example, draw with your left hand or try to write a story going backwards in time. Things that you wouldn't normally do. These are obstacles, and they might lead you in surprising new directions.
I'm going to do that myself. So, Dr. Ellen Winter, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Keith. It's a pleasure talking to you.
I've known Dr. Ellen Winter for a long time because we're both psychologists and we both studied creativity in the arts. I was reading her work back in graduate school in the 1990s, when she was already influential. Her research has grown in influence every decade since then. Her research helps us understand how the mind works when we're engaged in artistic activity. When we look at art, when we make art, our minds are engaged in profound cognitive activities that help us understand who we are. The arts aren't just pretty things that we look at or listen to in our leisure time. The arts are at the core of what it means to be human. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.